At the very most, the death penalty only paves over the cracks of a much bigger problem. The threat of punishment actually has very little to do with the rate of violent crime. How's it, everyone? Welcome to Sit in Arbiter. My name is Gilad Katsav. You can just call me Gil. I'm really excited to start this YouTube channel because I want to talk about law, and more specifically I want to talk about South African law. Recently I noticed that many people misunderstand really important areas of law, and that's what this channel aims to resolve. I aim to simplify the law as much as I possibly can so that you can get a better understanding of how it works, why it works in the way it does, and possibly a platform for you to recommend any reform that you may have with an informed opinion. Now, one of the first few cases ever heard in the Constitutional Court was the State versus Makwanyane case. This was the case that abolished the death penalty. And I think it's quite appropriate that this is also the topic of my first video. So in this video, you're going to learn three things. The first is, what are the arguments for the death penalty? Number two, what is the law's response to those arguments? And thirdly, most importantly, what are the chances of the death penalty being reinstated in South Africa? What are the arguments for the death penalty? Essentially, there are two arguments. There is the deterrence argument, which is about the discouragement to commit violent acts, and then there is the retribution argument, which is about punishment as a sort of revenge. So let's briefly chat about the deterrence argument. South Africa has an extremely high violent crime rate. We average almost 57 murders every single day in this country, and the rape statistics are shockingly worse. Statistically speaking, if you're a woman in this country, there is a 40% chance you may be raped at some point in your life. But these stories are common. I mean, we know about the university student who gets raped and murdered when she goes to the post office, or the little girl who is raped inside of a bathroom at a family restaurant. So the question is, how do we fix it? And this is where the death penalty advocates would come in and say, we give them the ultimate punishment, we give them the death penalty. That's how we fix it. The basis of this argument is sort of says that potential criminals will be hesitant to commit crimes with the knowledge that they may be killed for doing so, and therefore they refrain from committing it completely. It's a very consequentialist approach. If you think about it, it's sort of saying that the choice to kill a murderer or a rapist is in fact a choice to save an innocent life. Or conversely said, the choice not to kill a murderer or a rapist is in fact indirectly a choice to murder or rape an innocent life. Now, this argument only really works if in fact there is this deterrent effect. Importantly, when I speak about deterrence, I'm not saying there's a trade-off between deterrence in the death penalty versus no deterrent at all, because there is also life imprisonment, and that has deterrence of its own. The critical question that I pose to you is, does the death penalty have a sufficiently greater deterrent effect than life imprisonment? So much so that we can justify having it in our law. Academics approach this in two ways. So the first way of looking at this is the empirical way, essentially based on data and statistics and observation. And there have been numerous studies on this issue, and it really does depend on who you read and who you want to believe, because the studies are just so confusing. You can find some studies that say that there is absolutely a deterrent effect and that you 100% save lives if you have the death penalty. And then there's some studies that say that, yeah, maybe there is a little bit of a deterrence, but it's not that significant. And then you'll get other studies that say there is absolutely no deterrent effect whatsoever. So like, who do you believe? And this is the same problem the court had in Makwanyane. But the court came to the conclusion and said there is no conclusive or compelling proof that there is this deterrent effect. And you've got to understand that the court found that the death penalty is absolutely a human rights violation. It violates the right to life, the right to dignity, and the right to equality. And in order to justify those human rights infringements, you need compelling evidence that the death penalty does in fact deter. And there just wasn't anything like that. And that's why the empirical argument fails. Because plain and simply, there's just no proof that it actually deters to what it says it does. And I would venture to say that if one day such proof does appear, but elsewhere in the world, I'd say it would have no relevance in South Africa. To have relevance in South Africa, it would need to be based on South Africans, because South African criminals are motivated by different reasons for people elsewhere in the world. We have a very different socioeconomic problems, different cultures, different beliefs. People are incentivized based on different things. We have a great deal of unemployment and a great deal of inequality. So we need to have a South African study to see why criminals behave the way they do in order to have any relevance in this country. But if you think about it, the problem about this kind of study, it's really difficult to prove. How do you prove that someone would have committed a crime? In other words, we only ever see the effects of non-deterrence. In other words, we see that a crime has been committed, they are not deterred. But it's extremely difficult for anyone to go and say that absolutely this person would have committed a crime if not for the death penalty. And in there lies the problem about proving its deterrent effect. The second argument for the deterrent theory is the common sense approach. And you can try to tell me if there is a common standard for what is common sense. What's common for me isn't necessarily what's common for you. But that's besides the point. The basic idea of this argument is that the greater the punishment, definitely then the greater deterrent. It's sort of like the thinking that you know, when your dad said that you better clean your room before he gets home after work, and if you don't, you're going to get a hiding. So what you do, you go clean your room because you don't want the hiding. And that's essentially what the common sense approach is. It's common sense that people will be deterred, and it's basically based on the innate fear of losing your life for good. And the court in Makwanyane did consider this argument, and it said a few things about it. To briefly get to some of them, the court said that, number one, not all criminals are in fact afraid of death, and the reasons why they commit crime aren't necessarily related. Perhaps they committed out of it's a crime of passion. People are desperate, or they're intoxicated, or they have some pathological problem, or they just simply don't care. In other words, the criminals don't get to a point where they go, all things considered, I am why I'm not going to commit this crime. Another thing that the court mentioned, and this is a very real problem, is that there's a pretty low chance you actually get caught and then subsequently convicted, and that's just the truth of it. And lastly, the court also says it's extremely unlikely that criminals sort of do this weighing up analysis, that they say that, well, if I'm weighing up the risks of death versus the risks of life imprisonment, and even if they do this weighing up analysis, the court finds it even more unlikely that the criminal comes to the conclusion and says, well, the risk of death is extremely high, and therefore I completely refrain from it, but the risk of life imprisonment is not that great, so therefore I'm going to risk it and commit the crime anyway. That sort of thought process, the court says, is extremely unlikely. Now, some academics have criticized this, and they essentially say that perhaps some criminals do fit this profile. In other words, they are thinking rationally. They do get to the point and they go, all things considered. They do accept that even though there's a low chance that they may be caught and convicted, there is a chance nonetheless. And finally, they do this weighing up analysis and come to the conclusion that for sure the death penalty is far too much of a risk for them, and therefore they're not going to commit the crime at all, and essentially they are deterred. And what I would then say is that on this understanding that yes, the common sense approach does in fact deter. Where this argument fails, or perhaps where it's the weakest, is in how much does it deter. The court finds that it's probably only going to apply to a very few potential criminals that think this way, and most criminals don't follow this sort of thought process. So at this point, some of you may be saying, but Gil, even if it deters one single person from committing the crime, then surely that's enough to justify it. And I'd say you need to be careful of that sort of thinking, because then you're saying with absolute certainty that a murderer or rapist must with absolute certainty be killed, but only in the hope that an innocent life will be saved. Do you see why that is a potentially weak argument to be made? And like I explained before, this is a severe human rights infringement, and you need compelling arguments to justify it. And as I've explained, basically the deterrence theory, number one, doesn't prove to actually deter, or number two, it's not a particularly strong argument anyway. And that's why the deterrence theory fails. The second argument in favor of the death penalty is the retribution argument, and this is essentially about revenge. It's about getting even. It's a lot more subjective, and it's driven by emotion, and it's about seeing justice being done. And it's a bit of a tricky issue for the court to get around, because essentially what the court tells people is that their sense of justice is slightly misguided or slightly misdirected. And in other words, we need to take a step back. In order to see why this argument fails, we need to take a step back and take off the glasses of vengeance and look at it more broadly, and realize that South Africa came from a very violent and racist past. And now the state has the obligation to set the moral standards of society. And it sets those standards in line with the Constitution. And I think this point is probably best summarized by Justice Chaskelson, who was the judge in the Makwanyane case. And the Justice Chaskelson says here, in the long run, more lives will be saved through the inculcation of a rights culture than through the execution of murderers. In other words, the judge here is saying that if we want to save lives, we're not going to do it by executing other lives. We're deluded to think that that's actually going to save any lives at all. He says that we need a rights culture, and what he's saying is that the principles of the Constitution need to permeate, need to go through everything that we do. And when I say everything that we do, that includes how we punish violent criminals. Whether we like it or not, they are human beings at the end of the day. And it's essentially taking a stand and saying, South African law respects human rights. These are our values, and we will not compromise on them. And this is not to lessen the anger and the pain that the families and the victims go through, because there's righteous anger to be had. But what the court is saying is that the state must not fall into the trap, and it must not make the mistake of saying that the value of human life is variable. So don't get me wrong here, that of course criminals need to be punished, but how do we go about punishing them is the vital question. So sure, the retribution argument is nice in the sense that it makes you feel that justice is being done, an eye for an eye kind of thing, but at what moral cost? What are we really saying about ourselves, and what are we really saying about our state, that we want our government to put people to death and be complicit and be guilty of something that this country has fought so long and hard for to get hold of, and that's human dignity. Another quite interesting point that the court brings up in the Makwanyane case is the elements of arbitrariness. In other words, the randomness that is present in almost every single stage of the criminal trial process. And what that means is that it's a question of how good was the investigating officer at the crime scene? How good was the evidence left behind? What is the judge's personal feelings towards the death penalty? How good was the prosecuting advocate? How good was the defense advocate? Really, you also need to think about who's really going to be sentenced to death here, because I'll tell you for free that we're going to end up just be killing poor people. At the end of the day, we're going to be killing poor people, and on the rare occasion that the rich people are committing these crimes as well, they have the money to hire the best lawyers and the private investigators, and at the end of the day, like I said, we're going to be killing poor people. And you might be saying to me, Gil, these elements of arbitrariness exist today in the current system with life imprisonment. And I'd say, yeah, I agree with you, but the fundamental difference that I need to point out to you is that once you die, you're dead. There's an element to finality to it. There is no chance that new evidence comes to light and that we can change a wrongful conviction. There is no chance of rehab, and whether you like it or not, there is people that can be rehabilitated and put back into society and be productive member of society after they've served their sentence. So essentially, this is why it's so unappealing to have the death penalty, when in fact you realize that everything just depends. So this is essentially what the court finds. The court finds that there is a severe rights infringement on the right to dignity, equality, life, and they factor in all these elements of arbitrariness, and it's quite a high threshold to meet, and the evidence to try justify those rights infringement is pretty weak. I've explained that the deterrence theory just isn't conclusive enough, and the retribution theory only really works to degrade our moral society's values, but in reality there just isn't any practical use. And this is why the court came to the decision that the death penalty must be abolished. So moving on to the final question is, what are the chances that the death penalty can be reinstated into South African law? And the short answer is there's no chance. To be more legally precise, it's very unlikely that such a thing is going to happen. I say this despite knowing that a large majority of the South African population does want to see it come back. But you must also understand that at the time of the Makwanyane decision, the court was alive to this, or at least assumed as well, that the vast majority of the South African public did see the death penalty as the most appropriate sentence for violent crime. Importantly, the court said it's not a court of public opinion. It doesn't do what the majority of the opinion of the public want. What it does is it looks at whether it is in line with constitutional principles. It's a question of, does the Constitution allow for it? And in here lies the almost insurmountable challenge that people that advocate for the death penalty face. We must remember that the Constitution, part of the reason why the Constitution was enacted is to give a voice to the minority. So the argument that the majority of the South African public want this is in fact not a particularly great argument when you know that the Constitution is meant to protect the minority of people as well. And you also need to remember that the way the court abolished the death penalty, it did so by abolishing legislation. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say the death penalty is not allowed. What it did was it looked at the principles of the Constitution, and it looked at what is the effect of the death penalty, and it said these principles and the effect don't line up. There is incongruency there, and it doesn't match up with the principles of the Constitution, and therefore through an interpretation exercise it said that it's invalid and inconsistent with the Constitution. So to be very blunt, in my opinion, to bring back the death penalty, there's two ways. Number one, there is an amendment to the Constitution, which you'd probably have to have a 2/3 majority in Parliament to have such a thing, and it would have to expressly include that the death penalty will be allowed in South African law, because you won't be able to change the principles of the Constitution, but you may be able to perhaps expressly put it in there somehow. Yeah, the second option is is if the Constitutional Court one day turns around and says, hey, listen, we were completely wrong in Makwanyane. There is 100% a need for the death penalty in this country, and yeah, we're gonna overturn our own decision. I don't know if the Constitutional Court's ever done that. I don't think they've ever done that. Will they ever do it? I don't know. But those, as far as I'm concerned, are the only two ways that I actually see the death penalty coming back into South African law. And realistically, those chances, there's a very low chance that actually happens. So coming down to the final thing, I've explained to you so far. You've learned what are the arguments for the death penalty, and I explained to you why those arguments don't work in terms of how the law sees them. And finally, I've explained that there's pretty low chance that the death penalty ever comes back into South African law, well, at least under this constitutional dispensation. So now we come back to the question is, how do we deal with violent crime in this country? At the very most, the death penalty only paves over the cracks of a much bigger problem. The threat of punishment actually has very little to do with the rate of violent crime. And I want you to be careful when you advocate for the death penalty, because essentially what you're doing is you're giving leaders and you're giving politicians a free pass. You're giving them an excuse to say the reason why there is so much violent crime in this country is because we aren't able to put people to death. The law and the legal system won't allow us. When in reality, the reason why there's so much violent crime is because it's a lot deeper than that. We have little respect for the rule of law in this country, and that comes all the way from the top of the government through the different levels of government to big corporates and how they operate their businesses, all the way down to small businesses and all the way down to you and I. Another thing is that there is woeful law enforcement institutions in this country that are inept and inefficient at enforcing law and order. And finally, there's a great deal of unemployment and inequality in this country, and as long as those elements exist, it's always a vicious cycle, and it's always going to fuel violent crime in this country. So to be very clear, in my opinion, I think the only way to reduce violent crime is not to have this debate about what kind of punishment we're going to give to people. It's about fixing the system. It's about having strong political and economic institutions that work towards instilling a culture where we respect the rule of law, that works towards reducing inequality, so much so that it's as narrow as we can get it. And that is how we start, at least, to fix the violent crime issue in this country. So if you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe now. Comment if you have something to say. I'd love to hear from you. Share this video if you can. I've got so much more that I want to talk about, so let's keep it going. Yeah, and my final message to you today is to remind you that the law is only a tool, whether that is for good or for bad. But like any good tool, its real usefulness is in the hands of those who know how to use it and understand it. Remember, knowledge changes everything. Cheers for now.